A dark cloud hung over Europe in the year 1570. Political instability across the continent had been coupled with the total shattering of spiritual unity. The Catholic Church, an institution which guided the faithful for over 1500 years, was no longer trusted. The succession of various corrupted popes out of their seat in Bordeaux was in all likelihood the reason the Reformation began in Toulouse, another Occitanian city. The Pope of the age was Pope Clement XIX, a decadent old man, corpulent and wrathful, who was blindsided by the news of a movement against the Church. His influence was immense, with the devout monarchs Emperor Xavier II Monoton of Occitania and Emperor Edorta XVI Ortega of the Burgos Federation. They each accepted the charge of Pope Clement and moved against the Protestants in their empires. Immediately, they began to slaughter those who would not recant, which caused a civil war to break out in Occitania, and the Burgos Federation mustered an invasion of southern Occitania in support of their Catholic crown. The Emperor of France, Emperor Raphael IV Alary, sensing an opportunity, adopted Protestantism and used it as a casus belli to invade Occitania, as well as the German satellite members of the Burgos Federation. Norway, under King Grunwald Olafsson, had long been a struggling backwater, constantly fearful of Orthodox Livonian invasion. Because of this history and a growing minority of Protestants among the Norwegian merchant class, King Olafsson adopted Protestantism in the hopes that it would afford Norway the kind of support that Pope Clement failed to provide. Denmark, under Emperor Ake II af Aros, was now sandwiched between Protestant France and Norway, with an increasingly powerful Orthodox Poland to their east, and so declared an edict of tolerance for Protestants, aligning his nominally Catholic kingdom with the Protestants as a kind of international security. Alençon and Alsace then confirmed their loyalty to the papacy in the hopes of securing French and Burgosi lands in Central Europe, while Lombardia, under Emperor Adalberto Rastello, saw a dual opportunity to destabilize the Western Church they had a grudge against and resist the further expansion of the Eastern one, and decided to declare an edict of tolerance and join the Protestant bloc as well. The Orthodox world, meanwhile, looked on in horror at what was happening to Christendom, though they also thought of the opportunities such a thing could afford them. Poland, Visegrad, and even the Bulgars were rising stars in the east, while the Philippopolis Federation had long been jealous of Burgosi's success, and the Magyarország needed any victory it could manage to get. While they didn't make their move just yet, it was only a matter of time before they did. Vannonian responses to this were varied. Emperor Cyrus Benkovenesti was overjoyed, and would soon secure alliances with Norway, Denmark, France, and Lombardia, though the latter two were more active participants than the former. Duke Chazon Monad secured alliances with his distant cousin Xavier II in Occitania, as well as the Burgos Federation. The High Lords, meanwhile, deliberated on how they wanted to handle this sudden development. This would serve to be rather costly, but if dispatched rightly, things could come together for their good in the end. As such, they made preliminary contacts in Poland, though they did not necessarily trust them yet. The true stroke of genius was securing an alliance with Mali. Their leader, Mansa Nafisa Bamako, had been inert for some while, long contented to despotize over his own vast realm. Because of the days of blood engulfing much of the old world, almost all endeavors to colonize the new one dried up. Nobody needed slaves, but nobody needed hot weather crops either, because there was one colony in the new world already providing these things. Coincidentally, this was also their only customer, colonial Brazil, under the Grand Atlantic Charter. The High Lords approached Mansa Nafisa with a deal that colonial Brazil would purchase slaves at a greater quantity, while also using Mali as their contact for imported goods like coffee and cotton, which grew well in the New World. As a result, colonial Brazil would expand and the Mansa of Mali would grow rich again, able to centralize wealth and power, weaponizing it against his many subjects, who lived much the same as they always had. However, there were conditions attached on both sides. Mali insisted that they would only send castrated slaves to Brazil to ensure they would have to keep buying them from Mansa Nafisa. The High Lords accepted this and leveled their own condition, which was this. Mali would have to engage in piracy against, and when they were ready, actually invade the Burgos Federation. Mali was more than happy to accept this secret section of the agreement. Later that year, France invaded Rank on behalf of Emperor Cyrus, Occitania invaded Rank on behalf of Duke Chazon, and the High Lords managed to regain control of Naren. This was how the world stood, and indeed all nations involved were also broadly invested in the Vannonian Civil War itself, for that was the spark that essentially brought the civilized world to its knees. Unrest was universal. Riots were commonplace, and roving gangs of Catholics and Protestants wandered from town to town, committing acts of unspeakable violence against one another. Indeed, for 5 years, no territorial gains were achieved at all because of this. In 1571, in response to the Robe faction's expansion of Brazil, as well as their reclamation of Naren, Duke Chazon managed to colonize Newfoundland in the hopes of accruing yet more resources to fight this impossible war. The natives there were of a particularly violent disposition, but they were overcome and the place was colonized. The High Lords were displeased and determined that, of the 4 of them, one needed to take the helm for the duration of the war to ensure a more decisive decision-making. This man was High Lord Grichard Gorkuf of Rank. His first decision at the helm was to send an anonymous package to Duke Chazon, filled with pustules and buboes from a diseased man. This would actually lead to Chazon's death, leaving his son, Duke Vorgel Monad, to inherit his father's place at the head of the bloodline. In 1581, Emperor Cyrus produced an heir in the form of his daughter, Princess Sansra Brankovenesti, threatening the other factions with yet another person they would have to kill. Later that year, Astorius was overtaken by Protestant rebels from Occitania, entering into the Days of Blood. In August of that same year, a peculiar preacher in the region of Abkhazia began to promote what he called a reformed interpretation of Protestantism, teaching predestination, total depravity, and asceticism in life, spurning things like dancing or colorful clothes. The peculiar thing was that Abkhazia was firmly in the Orthodox heartland, and when this extreme brand of Protestantism began to encroach on the power of the Eastern Church, they were livid. Poland solidified its alliance with the Robe faction and moved against the Protestant nations of Europe, sending their armies west. Visegrad and the Bulgars also took this as an invitation, and the Philippopolis Federation set its sights upon Burgosi ships sailing in the Mediterranean Sea. In 1582, in the midst of all this chaos, the Grand Atlantic Charter continued to prowl the Atlantic Ocean, ensuring that anyone else foolish enough to attempt colonizing the New World would be met with unyielding fury. In 1583, a priest by the name of John Murge began to distribute localized copies of the Bible throughout Halby, in an attempt to convert the Catholic North. Duke Vorgel had him apprehended and subsequently burned at the stake with his books for kindling. In response, the Inquisition was formed by decree of the Duke. A series of laws were also passed the following year, like the Conventicle Act and the Blasphemy Act, which outlawed religious gatherings of more than 5 people not sanctioned by the Holy Catholic Church and made blasphemy a common law, making it a legal offense to ridicule or criticize God, Jesus, or the Holy Scriptures in any way. In 1584, Duke Vorgel sent men to help Occitania to invade Corsica, setting their sights on them as a valuable port in the Mediterranean. Hundreds of small battles took place over the course of that year, though by 1585 the most significant were clear. The Battle of Anjou saw the Occitans, backed up by Burgosi forces, launch an attack through Poitou and besiege the city, which was under the purview of the crown. The French, backed up by Occitan Protestants, marched through Orléans and engaged the Catholic armies in battle. Emperor Cyrus sent 20,000 men from the mainland to the port of Nantes in order to aid them, but met a naval fleet carrying a similar force, comprised of Blood faction soldiers aboard Burgosi ships. Neither force was able to land, sparking a separate naval battle, called the Battle of Quiberon Bay. Thousands perished in both battles, but disease soon set in at Anjou, and the harbor at Nantes was destroyed, leading to a unilateral retreat and no gains made on either side. These sister battles were emblematic of the kind of war the world found itself embroiled in. Nobody held enough overwhelming power to hold gains for more than a few days, and even when they did, an enemy would always be waiting to stab them in the flank. The following battle summaries are also excellent examples of the kind of fighting seen during the Days of Blood. There is the famous Battle of Vaud, where the Lombardians established a floating cannon platform on Lake Geneva to bombard the Burgosi town of Vaud, which responded by destroying the platform with fire. They would go back and forth until eventually the lake would be choked with debris and the city of Vaud would cease to exist, the land itself remaining in the control of the Burgos Federation. The Battle of Stettin saw Poland attempt to punch through to the Baltic Sea, bringing legions of cavalry regiments to bear in the form of the Winged Hussars. They stormed the city, sacked it, and held it for 2 months until the Protestant Danes, stationed from the nearby fortress island of Bjornholm, began to send small detachments of men in the dead of night to kill and burn and plunder, terrorizing civilians. One night they managed to burn the city down, and in retaliation, Poland sent flotillas of burning ships loaded with black powder to crash against the sea walls of Bjornholm, flooding the island and drowning the soldiers inside. The French moved in to reclaim the land upon which the ruins of Stettin stood, and nothing was gained. Then, of course, there is the Gulf of Gibus tragedy. Lombardia, with the aid of French ships, sailed from Malta attempting a naval invasion of the Burgosi city of Tunis, a separate entity from the country, which did not hold the very city it was named after. This naval invasion was made possible with the help of their ground forces in Sfax, invading through Kef. However, Burgosi ships intercepted them and engaged them in a brutal naval skirmish that would last for days. To ensure their victory, the city of Bizerte began to fire on any and all ships that desired to pass into the eastern Mediterranean. Among these were Lombardian civilian craft sailing south from Cagliari to escape Corsican pirates and Burgosi aggression in Sardinia. As a result, the islands of Malta and Jerba did the same, and anyone who failed to hear of this unannounced policy was sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. This resulted in mass starvation in Isbilia, which relied heavily upon food imports from the only country willing to trade with them, Tunis, which was completely arrested by the surrounding conflict and unable to utilize overland routes due to the Lombardian army in Kef. Typically, Tunis traded food to Isbilia for use of their westernmost port, and therefore access to the unclaimed island of Madeira. But now that relationship was interrupted, and thousands were left starving. Dozens of civilian craft attempted to get to Tunis themselves, only to be obliterated by the hostile naval presence on both sides. Strangest of all was the story of the Duchy of Saray. Once a neighboring mountain duchy to Abkhazia, they were so taken in by the message of the Reformed faith, they exploded past the Caucasus and invaded all their larger neighbors, making a respectable name for themselves as a proper power in the region and thorn in the side of the Orthodox camp. These battles occurred throughout the 1580s, and almost no gains were made by any side, with some exceptions. Poland exploded west, conquering much of the French holdings in Germany. Lombardia occupied some of Alençon. Occitania occupied some of France. The Philippopolis Federation claimed some of the Balkans. And most notably, Brandenburg managed to plant its flag in the face of unending war. Brandenburg was a German Catholic duchy that took the opportunity to declare war on Protestant France and take what it viewed as its own, German lands filled with the German people. It established Berlin as its capital and was even able to keep the invading Poles at bay. With access to the sea, Brandenburg and their capital of Berlin became another safe haven from the war, even setting up contacts with the Free City of Amsterdam to their west. In 1590, Emperor Cyrus Brâncoveanesti died, and his daughter, Empress Sansra Brâncoveanesti, ascended to the throne. Duke Vorgel sent her the raw head of a pig. When her guards didn't accept it, he had it launched at the capital Chashtal from a boat with a mounted trebuchet. The force of the trebuchet tore right through the ship and it sank, but the pig head found its mark, actually managing to strike and kill a servant. Empress Sansra was greedy like her father, but had none of his cunning. She was a socialite through and through and enjoyed parties, games, and plays as long as she was awake. The Crown faction which surrounded her took the lead, and it was effectively a regency council. Hearing of this turmoil and beginning to starve, the Free City of Amsterdam began to engage in piracy, specifically against the French to their north, but also targeting vessels belonging to the Grand Atlantic Charter. In 1591, the Pope affirmed the right of Duke Vorgel to colonize the rest of Canada from his base in Newfoundland, which sent the other two factions into a fit of rage. Later that year, reformed missionaries from Surrey landed on Vannonian shores, though they landed in Halby, which meant they were killed almost immediately. By 1592, the Vannonian crown won Corsica's main port, and the Robe faction won the Germanic province of Hoya from France. 1593 was a pivotal year in the Days of Blood. Mali began its official invasion of the Burgos Federation, and while they weren't able to give them much trouble outside of Africa, they were definitely drawing resources away from the main European conflict. Most significantly, however, Occitanian Protestants occupied and destroyed Bordeaux, leading the papacy to flee, changing its seat of power to the city of Lisboa in the Burgos Federation. Occitania, deeply threatened by this, decided to contain the Protestants in the south in order to focus on one problem at a time, and move against France with everything they had. However, the Monoton royal family would soon understand that in a war of several fronts, such a strategy was not a fruitful one. In response to the burning of Bordeaux, due to which Pope Clement would later die of his burns, the new Pope, Pope Calixtus VIII, convened the Council of Cantabria to address the Days of Blood and forge a response to the crisis the Catholic world found itself embroiled in. First came the reforms, including the elimination of indulgences, as well as holding priests and seminary schools to harsher standards of quality. Theologically, they reformed the doctrine of purgatory, stating that it was outside of human purview to affect or pray for the souls there. The Church also weeded out corruption and laid out a groundwork for how the Catholic world would heal once the Days of Blood were done. One of these planned reforms was the creation of the ordinary Mass, that is, a Mass to be provided in the vernacular at the discretion of a diocese and its archbishop. These were only a few of the reforms, but the Cantabrian Council was unacceptable to Occitanian Catholics on the whole, leading the new emperor, Emperor Jacques III Monoton, to declare Calixtus VIII a false pope. This lost Occitania all of its Catholic allies, sparking an invasion from the Burgos Federation, as well as from the Blood faction of Vannonia. The true crunch had begun for the Occitanians and their empire. If the Days of Blood didn't end soon, it would take their realm into the bleak mire of history. That divided empire realized what it had to do, and along their predetermined lines of civil conflict, fought the enemies of their country as separate vanguards of it. Inspiring, if a doomed effort. Meanwhile, the monks of St. Arlo, even amongst all this chaos, still penned their histories from the battered walls of Glasgow. In the year 1600, they penned an updated map of the world, the Cartographia Sanguinis. These holy men had taken it upon themselves for the last 80 years to explore as much of the world as they could, and explore they did. In such days, it was necessary to note upon the spiritual state of the place first. Protestantism had taken like a flame to dry grass, the crown faction of Vannonia, France, Norway, and Asturias all adopting it as their state religion, with Lombardia, Alençon, and Denmark adopting edicts of tolerance and throwing their lot in with them. The Catholics raged against this new state of affairs, with the Burgos Federation, Occitania, Alençon, Alsace, Brennenburg, and the Blood faction of Vannonia all renewing their commitments to the Pope and his Holy Catholic Church. The Orthodox world took this as an opportunity for growth, and did so, exploding west by means of Polish might. Christendom was divided, but politically Europe was, of course, in flux. Vannonia was a house divided against itself, fighting a bloody three-way civil war that sparked continent-spanning chaos. Iberia was dominated by the Burgos Federation, with some minor holdouts. They also held a great deal of North Africa and lorded over the Strait of Hercules, though this was beginning to be threatened by the suddenly aggressive Mali to their south. Surely the Burgos Federation, as seat of the papacy itself, would be a powerful colonial force were it not for the Days of Blood. Such was the story for most European nations of the day, focusing on slaughtering their brothers instead of planting flags in new lands. The Gallic region looked the same in the 17th century that it had for a great many decades, though tension was bubbling under the surface. The current division between the three great powers of Vannonia, France, and Occitania was a medieval conflict that seemed to be soon coming to an end. Whoever broke first, it was clear, would simply cease to exist. The Italian region was clearly the domain of Lombardia, though those old divisions between North and South remained. The North made up of Catholics, schismatic Catholics, but Catholics nonetheless, while the South was firmly a part of the Orthodox world, thanks to Venice, which at this point was long past its prime, serving now only as the regional focal point of a dissolute alliance. The Germanic region was perhaps more accurately the Franco-Polish region, given that French kingdoms fought against the long, snaking arm of Polish territory that reached almost to the North Sea. Two notable exceptions existed, however, as hopes for the German people as a whole and the final opportunities to preserve their culture. These were Kärnten in the south and Brenneberg in the north, centered out of Berlin and with access to the sea. Perhaps in such an age of chaos, they would soon be able to determine how to live their lives and run their country. Northern Europe saw Norway and Denmark align against the aggressions of the Orthodox East, threatened primarily by the militaristic Livonia. Only time would tell if an alliance would be enough. Eastern Europe was finally coming into its own, with the militaristic states of Poland, Visegrad, and the Bulgars conquering their neighboring tribes and even penetrating deep into Western Europe, though Bukhara, right on their horizon, was still a major concern of theirs. Of course, Saray was a black sheep of the region, fanatically Protestant and at constant odds with all of its neighbors. The Balkans were quickly becoming the domain of the Philippopolis Federation, with Wallachia and the Magyarország holding on for dear life. Anatolia was rather divided, but Neapolis, made up of Italian Catholics, seemed the most focused on becoming hegemon there. The eastern Mediterranean was much the same, Iskandaria holding its own against Lakandu, while Neapolis fought Sfax for control in the north, and the Attica League managed to hold on to Crete, a very long time past its prime. The Philippopolis Federation, around that time, also began to move south against Sfax, and would soon, in all likelihood, overcome them and win. North Africa was uncomplicated and neatly divided. Everything west of Iskandaria belonged to Catholicism, where the Burgos Federation dominated, though such hegemony was threatened by Mali becoming involved with the Days of Blood. The Middle East of the 17th century was solidly united under a resurgent Sunni Islam, and the nations thereof finally powerful again, enabled so by the Days of Blood occupying the lethal preoccupations of Europe utterly. Bukhara in the north had failed to make further progress into the Middle East, and the alliance that formed to resist them coalesced into a singular monolithic sultanate, Khorasan, which also formed as a plug against the Matarids to the east. The Razakids and Abdulids, while unable to reclaim the holy cities, were regardless able to halt the eastward advance of Orthodox Lakandu, which then focused its imperial ambitions southwards, penetrating deep into Ethiopia. Africa, by way of its proximity to Europe, was of course affected by the Days of Blood, but such conflict had also allowed the influence of Islam to proliferate from Mali to Madagascar. This was, save for the foreign European empires that were conquesting at the fringes of the continent. Within Africa itself, Mali was by far the most powerful entity. They had a teeming population, held in line by an unquestionably ruthless despot, and any aggression the various internal tribes directed at him, he directed back out at neighboring powers, and in the 17th century, that power was the Burgos Federation to their north. The Yao had long played second fiddle to Mali, and indeed were often raided by them. East Africa was split between Orthodox and Islamic forces, though minor kingdoms like Darfur and Kaffa managed to eke out an existence for themselves. Ajuran was thoroughly Islamized, adopted Arabic culture in full, and as such was one of the most stable and advanced countries in sub-Saharan Africa. The Sofala managed to improve their position since they were first observed, through a partnership with Ajuran, attaining a modicum of civilization. To their west, in the poorly charted Congo, lay the true natives of Africa. Beyond the reach of Christianity and Islam, beyond the knowledge of sail and black powder, beyond it all, a powerful nomadic warrior tribe was conquering lands that no other tribe had ever touched before. They quarreled with Mali and quarreled often, raiding their southern border for the treasures they obtained from trade with the white man, whom they had not yet seen with their own eyes. Their chief, Kateng Negreso Loanga, was said to be almost 7 feet tall, blind in one eye, and used a powerful European gun as a walking stick for his severe limp. He was more myth than man, but since the world beyond had finally heard of him, it meant that the clock was running down how long they could continue their primordial existence, untouched by the world beyond the basin. To the east, Asia was a wide and varied land, revealing its secrets to Europe, many of them for the first time. Religiously, the Islamic Bukhara separated Europe from Asia, which held its own various treasured religions. Tengri, that ancient faith of the Mongols, presided in the north, championed by the Manchu. Confucianism, the beating heart of Chinese civilization, spanned all the warring Chinese states, attempting to wrought order from chaos. Isolated Japan practiced its ancestral faith, Shinto, as its people had for uncounted generations before. Buddhism once attempted to establish itself on the islands, but their emperor, a descendant of their sun goddess, drove them out. It is said that they closed themselves off long ago, and in this way repel every incursion, either from soldiers, priests, or artisans. Buddhism had settled itself in Central Asia, split between Vajrayana and Theravada. Vajrayana was centralized almost entirely within Kham, while the Theravada sect enjoyed wide support across Southeast Asia, especially Kumai. Islam was also present in the sweltering jungle-laden islands of the South China Sea, though they were contested by the animists of the Philippines. Finally, India was firmly split, the Maturids solidly of the Jain faith, while the Bengals and other Indian states followed the ancient Hindu religion. There was much conflict between them. However, as diverse as Asian religion was, its political state of affairs was even more so. The major Asian powers were the Manchu, Maturids, Wu, Kumai, and Bengal, who exercised influence over their respective regions. China could very well be the nexus of all power in Asia, but one of the warring states would need to claim victory over the others. Wu and Manchu seemed the most well-poised, though everybody south of the Korean Bay hated the Manchu, seeing them as foreign barbarians following a strange religion. Japan could very well prove a formidable empire, though such a thing wasn't going to occur if they had no reason to break out of their shell. Finally, North and South America were stuck in the 15th century. Vannonia was still the only colonial power, and indeed, while those colonies were growing, nobody else had the time, money, nor motivation to make the trek and colonize further, especially given the Days of Blood sucking up absolutely all of their attention and resources. As a result, the continents were both ill-explored. Religiously, the colonies were Catholic, while the largely unperturbed tribes and native kingdoms were animist, Mayan, and Nahuatl, as they had always been. The Inca Empire collapsed on its own, divided into Charca, Chachapoya, and Quito. The Xiu controlled the Yucatan Peninsula, while the only contacted tribes in North America were the Micmac, who occasionally and tentatively traded furs with the Vannonian colonists to the north. Such was the world in 1600, brutal in places and tranquil in others. Soon enough, things would level out to peace once again, or so the chroniclers of St. Arlo the Evangelist hoped. The Church of St. Guthlac stood empty, and such a thing is a grave enough sin on its own. By 1616, the Occitanian defense collapsed, and was beginning to be divided up between the Burgos Federation and France. Arch rivals, they would do anything to attain an advantage over one another. Meanwhile, the Burgosi defense of the south was failing. The soldiers of Mali, armed and funded by the Robe faction, was in the midst of conquering that section of North Africa and even managed to conquer Gibraltar, halting all Atlantic-facing traffic, throwing Mediterranean Europe into even greater turmoil. To the north, Livonia had finally moved against Norway and Denmark, sweeping down the coast from the north and obliterating their frontier defenses. The two were totally unable to resist these winter warriors. The Days of Blood were rumored to have killed millions at this point, but that is impossible to know or quantify. In 1621, Poland entered into a golden age of technological innovation, spurred by its recent conquests making them even more of a force to be reckoned with. Hearing this, Empress Sansra Brankovenesti changed her decadent ways and demanded Vannonia embark on a series of domestic reforms to allow the Crown faction to win the civil war, and eventually for a united Vannonia to win its wars abroad. These included streamlining the national messenger service, turning it into a mail service, as well as breaking up certain landlord rights and easing crown involvement in the economy, allowing for competition and local innovation on the part of business. The Empress shed no tears for those who were swept to the wayside. She fired councillors, ignored artists, and defied nobility. In 1636, ships belonging to the Grand Atlantic Charter were the first of any European power to make direct contact with Japan and meet Shogun Yoshiteru Ashikaga, who had very recently overcome the incompetent emperor and installed himself as head of the shogunate, which was now the true power of that country. As such, he was duly curious about these odd foreigners. Later that year, the Empress died, and Empress Sinead Brâncoveanesti rose to the throne. In 1637, the Robe faction struck at the Free City of Amsterdam, scattering the surviving malcontents across the empire. This would sow their discontent everywhere poor people lived, but it wasn't going to be a particular problem for them just yet. It was from this reclaimed Amsterdam that they made a play for the rest of rank, which was bloody but ultimately successful. This was spurred on by the latest innovation of their Polish allies, rifling. Polish riflemen were the most accurate in Europe, and when paired with a terrifyingly efficient cavalry, they were unstoppable. It wasn't long before this innovation spread to places like Visegrad and Livonia, causing them to gather hegemonic power over their respective regions of Europe. The year 1643 saw further breakthroughs in the pan-European stalemate and indeed the rest of the world. France and the Burgos Federation made further brutalizing gains against the anti-papist Catholics of Occitania, who had begun to call their sect Sedevacantism, believing the current pope to be a false one. This would be a bothersome heresy to contend with alongside Protestant movements. The Burgos Federation was able to halt the advance of Mali at great cost to itself, since losing Gibraltar to them caused their economy to begin a precipitous decline. Lombardia was snaking its way further up into German lands, and Lecandu was being encroached upon by Neapolis and Khorasan, two states which were coming firmly into their own. Khorasan was of particular interest since they gained total control of the Strait of Hormuz, cutting off Lecandu from the Indian Ocean, since the Abdalids had achieved that centuries ago by controlling the mouth of the Red Sea. In the east, Wu and Yue were far and away the major contenders for the Mandate of Heaven, though the Manchus to the north still looked promising, leeching Chinese technology and culture from their ally at the moment, Shun. Such advancements had allowed them to effectively exile Korea from their own peninsula, their final refuge being the island of Jeju. Finally, a native alliance made up of the Ojibwe, Pequot, Huron, Mi'kmaq, and Ottawa launched a unilateral assault of Vannin, Canada, since the Catholic missionaries of the Blood faction would not take no for an answer. 24,000 natives came rushing out of the wilderness and committed a great slaughter, burning dozens of settlements, sparking the conflict known as the Manicouagan War. Duke Vorgel Monad did not take this lightly and diverted many thousands of men to his colony, who, upon their arrival, roamed the wild lands of the northeast for months, killing any and all natives they could find, even those not affiliated with the raid. Soon enough, the tribes were so depopulated that they essentially ceased to exist in all but name. Several miles of tribal land which thousands once called home, now inhabited by maybe a few dozen families. These tribes were never to recover, save for the Pequot, who converted and agreed to help the colonizers in exchange for the continued existence of their people. This move left the Blood faction vulnerable in Halby, however, and Empress Sinead made a play for the north, capturing Glasgow and only being stopped at Ayrshire. A grievous blow for the Blood faction. After this, however, things returned to a standstill. The Days of Blood are estimated to have taken 4 million lives by the middle of the 17th century. Empress Sinead suffered a bout of insanity in 1658, leaving the Crown faction to guide the empire. In 1660, they formed an executive council, which had more powers to control the actions of their monarchy. In 1661, the Crown faction accepted an alliance offer from the Philippopolis Federation, as they were desirous of their Orthodox neighbor's land. On the 25th of October 1665, Emperor Matadon Brâncoveanesti ascended to the throne. In 1669, Duke Vorgel elected to recover some lost power by way of continental politics. Due to some well-placed bribes, the papal conclave elected Coelestinus XX, a cardinal loyal to the Monad family, to the seat of the papacy. His first act was to sign the Treaty of Marbella, affirming the right of the Blood faction to the region of colonial Eastern America, allowing them to create the unified colony of New Vannonia. Meanwhile, the Days of Blood had exacted a terrible price upon the peoples of the world. While their emperors and kings quarreled overhead, they dealt with the taxes and the tariffs and the bread prices and the civilian casualties. It was worst under the purview of the Robe faction, where those outside of the Brazilian colony were abused in the highest order. First were the legions of castrated slaves, who they had so many of due to their deal with Mali. They sometimes just forced them to work until they died to be replaced with another sorry soul. But the plight of slaves wasn't taken into account in these days. Even with the slaves, they still managed to squeeze every cent out of the farmers they ruled over. Farmers and artisans in Naren who failed their quota sometimes had everything they owned confiscated from them, and other times prowling officers of the GAC stole young men from their families and pressed them into service on the high seas. This inflamed the once free people of Amsterdam, and a low-level insurgency cropped up all across the home islands, headed by the group known as the Daneley Movement, known outside of the Manx language as the Democratic League. The Daneley Movement met in secret pubs and cafes across the Isles, fomenting unrest and revolution against all the factions, thus becoming a kind of fourth faction in and of themselves. Direct ideological descendants of the Amsterdam rebels, they advocated for radical new ideas, born from their suffering. They fought for freedom from kings and aristocrats, freedom to pray how they pleased, and the freedom to choose from their fellow man who ruled over them. By 1672, there was a Daneley cell in every city and town with a place to sit and drink. At the moment, it was a headless movement, but given the critical mass it was gaining, this would not be the case for very long. The other factions didn't necessarily consider them, viewing each other as the graver threats. This actually allowed their ideas to spread via pamphlets to the other nations of Europe, especially France, Livonia, the Burgos Federation, and the Philippopolis Federation. Why it didn't catch on in Lombardia or Poland was anyone's guess, but many attributed that to the structure of their militaries placing less of a burden on the average person by way of internal bylaws and civilian obligations. In 1680, facing down the face of doom itself, Norway and Denmark became the dual crown of Scandinavia, joining forces in the face of certain death to drive back the Livonian foe as one country. On the 18th of December 1681, Empress Astrid Berkovenesti took the throne, and Duke Fingolo Monad took his place at the head of the bloodline. In 1692, Catholic Sedevancantists revolted against the Blood faction in Halby, leading 13 regiments, which were then quickly returned to dust early in the next year. By 1698, the Burgos Federation had their will to fight utterly broken after a seemingly eternal two-front war with France and Mali, which left a pocket of Occitania exposed for certain Vannonian factions to exploit. By 1700, Occitania was left a landlocked, one-province kingdom surrounded mostly by the Burgos Federation, indifferent to their plight as they faced their own apocalypse. On the 25th of October, a certain group of Daneley rebels in London torched the city, causing total devastation. It burned for 4 days straight until there was nothing left, and it was from these ashes that Daneley cells all over Vannonia raised their flag in revolution, under their general, Onfroy Amalib. General Onfroy was once a lapdog of the crown, but after one of the many atrocities they committed against the people of Halby to the north, he decided enough was enough and defected. In fact, many said it was due to him and his money that the Daneley movement got any traction at all. By year's end, they captured London, Kent, Essex, and Norfolk, the first territorial claims of the Federal Republic of Vannonia. Meanwhile, Poland in 1701 was a monstrous force moving in every direction, exploiting the chaos of the Days of Blood for their own gain, much the same as their neighbor Visegrad. Even Scandinavia was having some luck, a rising Protestant star to rival the Orthodox Poles. Daneley revolutionaries tore through the country, soon occupying the Netherlands, and by 1715 capturing all of rank. The High Lords began to kick renewed colonization efforts into high gear in order to resist these upstarts when they came. same as the Blood faction, swelling the bounds of New Vannin like it was their final chance at life. Empress Astrid, fearing for her life, took many thousands of men which once defended against Halby and directed them south to obliterate the revolutionaries in the southeast. The Battle of Norfolk was a success of the highest order for the Empress, driving them out across the Channel back to rank. However, this set off a truly devastating domino effect. The Daneley revolutionaries, having been rebuffed in this way, sent perfidious agents across the whole of Europe, managing to spark similar revolutions in the Burgos Federation, France, and Brenneburg by 1720. During those same 10 years, Duke Fingola Monad of the Blood faction managed to seize upon such an opening in the north that the fair Empress Astrid left open for him, surging down from the hilly highlands of Halby to loose devastation upon the lands of the Crown. Indeed, several battles were fought and won, landslides all. The Crown faction had lost its momentum, and now lay dying. The Glasgow Massacre in 1711 involved the rescue of the St. Arlo Scholars, the city's immediate surrender, and the ensuing razing of Glasgow, which was pummeled by a cannon fire for 3 days and nights as revenge for well over 100 years of war. As the boots of the rightful heir crunched over the gravel of that city, he attacked the capital of Chastal itself, committing his entire navy to the effort in this siege of Chastal in 1715. Indeed, the false empress had forged for herself a gigantic sea chain, guarded too by ships of her own, light and quick and ready to board the boats of the dreaded invaders. Duke Fingola, instead of simply waiting beyond the sea chain, ordered a quarter of his ships to be emptied of men, and the sea chain rammed. Indeed, the chain broke, and fighting continued around the city until 1716, when the men of the Blood faction stormed the city and apprehended the Empress Astrid Brynkovenesti. In the courtyard of the royal city, she was brought to a dirty, overused block, caked with decades of criminals' blood and bits of bone from more recent executions. Duke Fingola, dressed in the costume of wild men that comprised the most distant of his ancestors, came into the courtyard bearing a long, rounded, heavy sword. He plucked that ancient crown from her head and asked her if she had anything else to say before her death. Choking back tears, the young woman began to beg for life. As the Duke circled around behind her, she was interrupted when he brought the cruel blade down upon her. Instead of beheading her, the Duke cleaved her down the middle, cracking her head in twain, splitting her to the navel. He stood there, staring at the viscera as cannons fired at the ocean in glory. Dozens of onlookers vomited. Women could be heard crying. While his supporters knew she had no right to the throne, she was still of some noble blood, and they believed that afforded her a worthy end. What the Duke had done was a crime, with no other sense of the word to describe his atrocity. But now, Emperor Fingola Monad ascended to the throne of Vannonia, and there was nothing to be done. The blood had found itself returned to glory, and the Black Dragon thrashed at those who had denied it its birthright with impunity. The members of the Crown faction who didn't manage to escape were tortured in medieval, grotesque ways, and these things continued for years after Astrid's mutilation. By 1720, the Crown faction had completely collapsed, all its territory going to vengeful Fingola, remorseless lord of the north. While Emperor Fingola was securing his victory, the Daneley revolutionaries were sending diplomats the world over in an attempt to secure allies from beyond the waves. Indeed, most failed to receive them, and the Qing, successor state of the Manchu, were most hostile of all. Because they attempted to kill the men, they went amongst the people of that strange and alien land, speaking to them of a new order that could rule their country. Freedom from a despotic emperor that cared not for them or their well-being. The Qing were decentralized enough, and their sufferings similar enough, that this message began to take root there before they were discovered and executed by drowning. During that time, the Philippopolis Federation, inflamed with revolution, was targeted by Poland, which continued its lightning invasion of Europe. Meanwhile, because of the stresses of the war against Livonia, Scandinavia fell to revolution much the same as all its neighbors. By 1730, the Blood faction led a dual assault against the Robe faction on Naren and the Daneley revolutionaries in rank, and indeed, both were terribly successful. No battle story was to be told here. Naren was simply overcome, washed over by countless soldiers. Rank was a more difficult win, due to the mass conscription of regular citizens into the Revolutionary Guard of President Onfroy. Regardless, Emperor Fingola conquered the regions of Normandy and Brittany in Western Rank, which is to say, the best and most important regions of Rank. He had to regroup at that point, however, allowing Onfroy's men to rest and train in this dark hour. Meanwhile, the High Lords of Vannin watched nervously as their position was suddenly and fatally threatened. They once again mustered the people of Pertgorum to work their fingers to the very bone, and by 1734, they set the Great Armada of the Grand Atlantic Charter east, strategizing aboard these very ships sailing for Vannonia itself. Meanwhile, Emperor Fingola was settling into his role upon the rightful throne cruelly and without remorse. To punish the people for not rising up in revolution to put his forefathers back on the throne, he levied heavy taxes from them, and would test random towns and cities for loyalty. His armies, which had indeed developed an alien culture to the rest of the country over the course of the Days of Blood, were allowed to do as they pleased, abusing the people with impunity. To some, war itself seemed preferable. But when Fingola spotted the Armada, 200 ships at least, he dropped everything and rushed his navy into action, or rather what was left of it. Fingola foresaw that they would land at Naryn, and positioned his 110 heavy ships at the western coast of that island. However, that was not their objective. They sailed south of Naryn and landed at Cornwall, where nobody was to stop them. Fingola's navy sailed south and east in a panicked rush, nearly crashing against the Armada as they began the Battle of St. George's Channel. The poorly trained yet masterfully equipped soldiers of the Robe faction's GAC immediately captured Cornwall, Somerset, Hampshire, and Oxfordshire, before being intercepted by the poorly equipped yet uncomparably trained Northern Army of the Blood faction, sparking the Battle of Lincolnshire. The Robe faction took up positions within the city, hoping to make the battle a siege, but the soldiers of the Blood faction were able to let themselves in by way of secret passage that the paranoid Fingola had burrowed in that city. Weeks of urban warfare would ensue with no clear winner, until outside help arrived. The Battle of St. George's Channel took so long to reach its end because the Blood faction managed to get behind the Armada and land itself at Cornwall, firing at the Armada from the shore. After weeks of back and forth shelling, the Armada was regardless able to break upon the coast, defeat the haggard sailors they met there, and march to Lincolnshire, where they were able to break the stalemate and go on to claim a large swath of the south. This separated Emperor Fingola from his gains in rank, allowing the Revolutionary Guard to launch a ruthless assault, reclaiming their lost territory by 1739. During that time, the revolution of Scandinavia had succeeded, exiling their emperor and installing a federal republic set to have elections once their war with Livonia was over. It was also that year that a sizable revolution broke out in the lands of the Qing far to the east. The Burgosi Revolution had not been won nor put down, though their crown still gave material and volunteer support to Emperor Fingola, so the Robe faction gave word to the Mansa of Mali that now was the time. Indeed, their armies came rushing up out of Gibraltar and devastated the country, conquering over half of their home peninsula before being stopped. Their conquest resembled something more akin to the sack of Rome than a modern military victory. Instead of conquering the cities and installing useful administrations to make them theirs, the Malians sought only to reduce them to rubble, extract their wealth, erect mosques, and build a wall on their new northern border. Indeed, what occurred there was nightmarish, and made possible only by the invisible hand of the High Lords. Soon, the High Lords were able to ship ever more men to the home islands through Cornwall. Indeed, from 1739 to 1745, they managed, by way of sheer numbers alone, to conquer the lands of Satsun, Naryn, and even Halby. But when it came to take the Isle of Vannin itself and that ancient beleaguered city, more effort was required of them. For months, every gun on the isle would fire through the days and nights, until trebuchets were set up to fire upon approaching ships, and indeed until garbage and corpses were going from crude machines against the High Lords and their armada. Eventually, the soldiers of the GAC managed to gain footing on the isle, and urban fighting went on for days, until they found Fingola, covered in the mingled blood of his own men and theirs, and fought that contingent himself. It was said he killed 30 men before they managed to fell him. Pengola died gloriously, in a manner his forebears would be proud of, though he did die without any children to speak of, leaving behind a caste of nephews and cousins who fled to New Vannin. In the ruined capital, the High Lords convened and established an oligarchy. The High Lords became the oligarchs, and their representative from among them, Prishard Gorkov, was named Lord Protector of the Empire. Between 1745 and 1746, the Lord Protector proved himself no less cruel than the man he replaced. With the death of the monarchy, they were no longer bound by its ban on slavery, so the Lord Protector and his oligarchs decided to make slavery a punishment for lapsed debts. In order to preserve their lucrative deal with the Mali, who were quickly becoming dependent on their interaction, this slavery punishment included castration as a prerequisite. The people of Brazil grew bitter that they were not delivered independence, as they were promised, and when they rose up, they were cruelly put down. It was clear that their movement had been totally co-opted by the High Lords for their own personal gain. In 1748, this became unbearable, and hundreds of thousands of suffering people rose up in revolution against the Lord Protector Gorkov, throwing in their lot with the Dinely revolutionaries. Even the unlimited wealth of the Grand Atlantic Charter was not enough to save them when half of their army was felled in a single week. Not all the mercenaries in the world could stop what was coming, especially as the Republic of Scandinavia aided them, sending arms and goods. By 1751, the Revolutionary Guard had captured the city of Chashtal, and Lord Protector Gorkov was put on trial, along with his oligarchs. They were each found guilty of fraud, murder, and crimes against the people, and were summarily hanged, one and all. In 1752, General Onfroy passed in his sleep, and so an election was held, leading to President Somerled Euan beginning his term of office over the new Federal Republic of Vannonia. That same year, jarred by total devastation and seeing the invasions of Mali and Poland into Western Europe as existential threats, the conflicting parties met on the Isle of Malta, held by the neutral country of Sfax. Even Polish representatives were present, though Mali was excluded. Drafting and negotiations went on for nearly a year before everybody was ready to sign, but eventually the Treaty of Malta was ready. The clauses therein were as follows. First, a general peace and cessation of conflict. Recognizing that the days of blood were some of the darkest in human history, that general peace was to bind the signatories for at least 50 years. Next, the battle lines were to remain as they were, being established then as the official borders of those signatory countries. Next was an agreement of Christian toleration that all houses of Christendom, from Catholicism to Orthodoxy to Protestantism, were to be at least tolerated as brothers in the wider Church of Christ. There would be an ongoing agreement concerning colonial endeavors to consult one another and ensure that those aspirations did not lead to another desperate age of conflict. Next, the transformation of Lombardia into the Empire of Italy was formalized to unite the broad range of Italian cultures that they had managed to subsume during the Days of Blood. Interestingly, the most detailed part of the treaty was the nationalization of the maritime company known as the Grand Atlantic Charter. As an independent entity, it held far too much power, but its armada and administrative infrastructure was too valuable to simply destroy. So the federal government of Vannonia wanted to use this opportunity to set an example of responsible resource allocation for the rest of the world, especially other, weaker democracies. It was declared that the Grand Atlantic Charter would have its governing board replaced with elected officials and be stripped of its chief officer, replaced by the president of Vannonia himself, who would act in that capacity. In this way, Vannonia was able to bring the rabid tides of invisible market forces to heel, while still benefiting from them. Finally, the Mediterranean was to be established as a sea of safe passage for trade and civilian craft, to avoid the naval tragedies that the Days of Blood had made so common. The signatories to the Treaty of Malta were Vannonia, France, the Burgos Federation, Italy, Scandinavia, Alsace, Alençon, Poland, Neapolis, and Wallachia, which had almost entirely been exiled to the Caucasus as a result of the war. And so, on the 29th of December 1753, after 193 years, the Days of Blood finally ended. It is thought that the Days of Blood claimed somewhere between 9 and 12 million lives, which is to say, 20% of Europe's total population perished, with some places seeing declines of 50% or more. 193 years, that should have been spent exploring the new world, inventing new technologies, researching how the world works, producing art and culture, and achieving heights of glory for the human spirit, was instead spent in a hateful conflagration against brother countries. Christendom turned inward against itself, wasting generations of young men and untold tons of treasure on little more than hate. Regardless, the days of blood had ended, and indeed, by 1820, 70 years on from the signing of the Treaty of Malta, Europe had not broken its peace. During those 7 decades, many things came to pass. Many saw that period as a kind of golden age, where centuries of lost progress finally caught up to the survivors of the conflict, which many came to call the Pax Maltensis. It was during those first 70 years of the Pax Maltensis that the astronomers of Europe not only confirmed the Earth revolved around the Sun, but also observed and catalogued several planets, including the theoretical planet of Neptune. Other achievements included the invention of calculus, the discovery of light refraction, the theory of gravity, and perhaps most practically of all, the invention and perfection of the steam engine. This is all to say nothing of art, which flourished in that age, leading to the development of new instruments and arrangements for them, causing symphonies to become wildly popular and their composers even more so. Artists of every stripe were finally able to appreciate the beauty of the world as it had become more beautiful after emerging from centuries of blood and grime. Of course, everything wasn't perfect. Religious violence between the denominations was reasonably common, starvation was an issue as populations recovered, and the economies of Europe were struggling to return to their former robustness. But, regardless, times were better than they had been for a very long while. In Vannin specifically, the surviving monks of St. Arlo the Evangelist returned to their sacred home of the Church of St. Guthlac, which by some miracle had remained undamaged all that time. The Republic of Vannonia began to fly a new flag, a red St. George's cross on a gold background, using that Dragon Slayer's cross to signify that the dragon had indeed been slain, and because of that fact, golden prosperity awaited the young Republic. The capital was also changed from Vannin itself, that ancient seat of the monarchy, to the city of Cumbria, a city which had found for itself new vigor after the days of blood, growing by the day. New Vannin was wrested from the last members of the Monad royal family, though many of them were never apprehended, and it is thought that they took up new names and became masters of business in Pert Gorum, though whether that is true or not remains a mystery to this chronicle. Vannin Brazil was brought back into line, and its headless independence movement was assuaged by rescinding the many taxes that weighed heavy on their people. Those colonies also expanded duly, making deals with some natives and overcoming others in order to ensure the security and prosperity of the empire. To the east, the Qing Revolution was a success, becoming a grand republic of the Qing, an anomaly in Asia, adopting the stabilizing religion of Confucianism to help organize and administer this new government. The Kondu and the Matarids had managed to explode outward in every direction, becoming masters of the Middle East and Central Asia respectively, growing rich on the renewed font of European trade. Finally, the very first seeds of colonization from the other European powers began to take hold. The Republic of Scandinavia colonizing the Caribbean, and the Burgos Federation settling South America and South Africa along the Cape of Good Hope. For better or worse, this was the world that nearly 200 years of war had afforded its combatants. The scholar monks of St. Arlo the Evangelist often speculated about the world to come, but after the last 2 centuries they realized that not even they could predict what was to come next. As the battered world enjoyed its long peace, there was but one question on everybody's mind. Would it last?